Hey, welcome, ACSA friends, family, colleagues. Thanks for joining our emergency ACSA hosting, talking about school reopening guidance. It seems like our emergencies these days are a lot different than they used to be. Emergency snow days, those times in the cafeteria when they ran out of those mini cartons of chocolate milk. We're talking about much more significant things these days, and I want to applaud all of your efforts in these unprecedented times. I want to thank the team that you're about to hear from, who's been working last night, today, getting ready for what they might hear, and then really digesting and diving into what they did hear. So thank you to the team you're about to hear from. You probably know that on your behalf, we've been advocating for a variety of things related to school reopening. In fact, we convened that ACSA School Reopening Work Group. We produced a final report that hopefully all of you have seen. And within that final report, there were a couple of sections that I'd like to mention today at the onset. One is our call to action, wherein we asked for quite a few things, but one of the things that we prioritized was the public health, student and staff well-being, focusing on safety. And we said, California Department of Public Health must provide explicit safety protocols necessary for reopening schools. We also had in there essential commitments to equitable education. I think this is one of the components unique to our reopening guide that you didn't see in so many other reopening guides, because at the end of the day, we're about educating our students as we, of course, protect their safety and the safety of staff. But within those essential commitments, we asked for a couple of things. I want to mention three things. One, support for teachers across all grade levels and courses to focus their instruction so every student masters essential standards through direct instruction, in person or virtual, received regularly. We also asked to assess student learning to ensure that students are progressing, engaged, and to proactively support meeting every student's academic progress. And then to support the physical and mental well-being of students, integrating social emotional learning into our academic core. And so we advocated at your direction on safety, and the state stepping up and making explicit the requirements for doing so. Because as you have said, you are experts in the world of teaching and learning, school, district, and county operations. You are not scientists, you're not doctors, and you're not public health experts. But that we also prioritized in your realm of expertise, high quality learning opportunities for all students. And so we heard the announcement today, and we certainly applaud the governor for listening to what you have been asking for. The governor certainly attempted to try to depoliticize these issues that he and all of us know are out in the field. In fact, many of you know that our administrators, educators, leaders have been receiving death threats in instances for recommending that they're going to start the school year with face coverings. And so the governor was attempting to depoliticize that, to take you out of that conversation by making that a requirement. He also said some things about rigorous instruction. So again, we applaud the effort. The challenge is in the details and the lack of specificity. When they say there are these absolute standards, it doesn't seem like they're all that absolute at all. As a team is going to dive in, and I'll let them really elaborate on this. As you heard today, there's so many questions about the data. 5% of what? 5% of whom? Who are the cohorts? Who's doing the testing? Who's providing the testing information? Who's paying for the testing? So there were certainly more questions than answers. There was also a section about testing our employees once again, how do we test hundreds of thousands of employees in California every 2 months when we don't have enough tests currently in the state, when those testing delays are as great as are being reported? And that's not a criticism of our state. Our state is doing well. They're putting a lot of efforts in this regard. Our governor, the legislature, our folks are doing a good job. The point is, there just isn't enough of it right now. And that's a national issue. Still, how are we going to test hundreds of thousands of people when we have a shortage of tests? And what about the specifics? Where are they getting the tests? Who's paying for the tests? Are the tests being done during work hours? Are we paying mileage to go get the test? Certainly all of these things are going to have to be discussed at the table with our allies, and that's going to take time away from the work. And so while we applaud the governor for stepping up and saying today there are standards, we fear that the ambiguity of those standards, the kind of the lack of concrete detail, the time it will take to mitigate that ambiguity at the table with our allies may chill your efforts to open physically this fall. And that concerns us. It concerns us because we know where it is safe to do so, the best thing for students and adults is for them to get into the classroom in person and receive direct instruction. And so to chill that effort, to undermine some of the great work you've already done, some of you, is concerning for us. A measure of gratitude for the effort, a lot of confusion and concern over what's going to happen ultimately. One more point, and then I'm going to turn this over to the experts on our team. Our focus, as I mentioned, besides safety, was rigorous, equitable, high quality instruction. So when the governor today mentioned rigorous and as rigorous as in-person instruction, and then left it at that, what does that mean? Does that mean that we are going to compel every educator to provide daily, synchronous, educator to student instruction, to provide assessments, to provide interventions, to differentiate the content and the delivery so that it is equitable, so that it is accessible by all of our students? Is that what we mean by high quality? It is what we mean, but is that what he means by rigorous? And is there anything to compel people to actually do that? Or can we say that we want rigorous, but allow there to be passive educational opportunities in our system in the fall? In other words, students downloading content and filling out dittos. Or are we going to demand more, and not just demand, but hold folks accountable for doing more? So a lot of questions. We appreciate the effort, but let's dive in. Let's clarify where we can and help you, as we always attempt to do. So let me pass this off to Edgar Zazueta, Dr. Edgar Zazueta, our Senior Director of Governmental Relations. Take it away, Edgar.
Thanks, Wes, and thank you all, our friends here. Even though we haven't been together for months, in many ways it feels like we're together on a regular basis here. And just thank you for continuing to show up, whether it be on our Facebook chats, our weekly meetings that we're having with a number of our councils. These meetings, it's appreciated. And I know we're trying to do something ambitious here. As Wes stated, the governor stopped talking just a little over 2 hours ago. This is fresh off the press. But we really thought you folks are the ones who get the calls. You're the ones who have to respond to questions from parents, from your community. So even at the risk of not having every single answer for you, we wanted to get out there and try to get as much information to you as possible. And that's what you're going to hear today. I think with that, I'm going to hand it off to members of my team right now. And we're going to really touch on some of the main topics that we got from the governor's statements today, kind of just to set a little bit of context. So today, the governor announced a redrafting or a revision of the industry guidance, and members of our team will link that in the chat in terms of, so you could see the full guidance. And this is guidance that you had probably already seen before from the California Department of Public Health. And this was the guidance that was initially talking about the recommendation for face masks, for disinfection, for physical distancing. We had talked about that, and most of you probably very familiar from that, just because that was the basis for a lot of our school plans, our school reopening plans. What the governor did today was provide a revision of that. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that, many of which you're probably familiar with. One, the current health situation in California has shifted dramatically, given the rates, given, unfortunately, day by day, it looks like we're looking at headlines where California is breaking records in terms of one-day COVID rates. So for that reason, there was a need to at least reflect. Was the guidance that came out, I believe, in June. It was literally, it feels like it's ancient now, but it was only a month old. That, and I think we have to be very transparent and very direct, as Wes was talking about. The landscape has shifted also because some of our stakeholders and our employee groups have kind of put a strong message there in terms of being hesitant to get back into the classroom. And there was a very public display of that over the last couple of weeks in terms of letters to the governors and to our policymakers. These issues became so noteworthy that you had the President of the United States commenting on what was happening in California. So what happened today is the governor is reissuing that guidance. What you will hear in the guidance, and Derek will specifically speak to this, a lot of it, and we're a broken record here, is guidance. There are considerations. For the first time, there's a few changes here, and we'll dig in that and kind of put a pin on that, where there is now some specific mandates in terms of where it is not the authority of the local school leader or superintendent or board to make the decision of whether a school should be open or be providing distance learning. That has shifted. Where we're going to spend most of our time is talking about the areas where some of this shifted and changed, namely the protocols and the considerations for either closures, partial closures of schools. This framework that the governor presented, that was a big piece of it. There was also some noteworthy news on the issue of face coverings, and Yvonne will touch on that. And we will still touch on a number of the issues, just looking at the questions that we're already getting. And we asked for participants to send us some questions before this chat. We were overwhelmed with the questions, quite frankly. So we're going to try to touch on that. But I've already seen some themes again around the considerations of distance learning, some specifics around special ed and IEPs, bringing in small groups. So we're going to just try to do as much as we can of just trying to answer questions and engaging in conversation here. And we will commit to you that whatever we don't get to here in our session, we will try to put out some information. We are working on a summary of just comprehensive of the guidance that was put out. So obviously this is day one of the conversation. We wanted to get you as much information as we can today, but we will continue to talking to you in the days to come. So with that said, let's jump into the content. I'm going to hand it off to Derek. We're going to be monitoring the chat. So one thing, just logistically, there's a chat room. We always love the chat room because that actually informs our advocacy, gives us a temperature of where you're at, what you're feeling. So feel free to utilize that. The question and answer, if you have a specific question that you want us to answer, the team is going to be monitoring that, and we will be trying to check as many of those off as well. So feel free to utilize both. Derek, let me hand it off to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Derek Lennox, a legislative advocate and attorney with ACSA. Happy Friday. We have some updates for you on a number of different issues that I'm going to walk through, and I'm going to provide an agenda of where we're going right now so you can anticipate that. First, I want to talk about reopenings for all schools this coming year, which is the big question everybody's facing. Second, I'll talk about school site openings and closures. Third will be school district opening and closure guidance. Fourth is testing guidance and recommendations, which Edgar and Wes alluded to. And then the fifth item will be how to address symptoms at school. And then I'll kick it over to Yvonne for masks and some other items. So two important documents that we want you to know about, and this is where all of this is coming from today. The first is a 4 or 5 page document called the Reopening Framework. And you can search it at home by using the title there. This is really talking about reopening and testing the issues that I'll be addressing. And then the second item is the industry guidance. This is an update on the document that many of you saw from back in June, and Yvonne's going to touch on that. Now, the one thing, and I'll go to the next slide, please, that I want you guys to listen for here is the words that we're using. Normally in statute, when the government wants you to do something and is going to require you to do it, they're going to say words like requirement or requires. They're going to say must or shall. In most of these documents that we're talking about, all except for one case, which I'll identify here, the words that you're going to be hearing are should and recommend and may. That means that you at the local level are going to have the discretion as an LEA to be able to make the decisions for your district about what direction to go on any of these items. I know that some of you are wincing, thinking, I wish the governor would have just told us what to do so that I can fall back on that. But the other half of you are probably thinking, I'm glad that he didn't tell us exactly what to do. So let's get into some of the shoulds, musts, shalls, and recommends. The first is broad, reopening for the new school year. What do you need to know? LEAs and schools may reopen at any time if they're not on one of the county monitoring lists within the past 14 days. You can find that monitoring list online. Right now, there are 33 counties. So what does this mean? If you're in one of those 33 counties within the last 14 days that the county's been on the monitoring list, what they really mean is you shall not reopen until you hit that 14-day mark of being off the county monitoring list, once your county turns that off. And this is the only instance in the rest of the presentation that I will use the word shall or must, because the governor made it really clear during his press conference. If you're in one of the 33 counties, you're on distance learning to start the year. You're on probation. Just try not to get to the super secret probation, but you're on probation to start for at least the 14 days until you're off the list. We'll talk about how to go online. I shouldn't use the word online, how to go back into in-person learning after that in a little bit. So the only thing that I want to note here is that even though we use a lot of should and recommend throughout the rest of this presentation, LEAs are subject to SB 98, the big budget bill from this year that does state districts shall offer in-person instruction to the greatest extent possible, except as specified. And we've talked a lot about what those specifications are for the parents and the students, the rights that they have to opt into distance learning, and for the districts to determine that they want to go school-wide or LEA-wide distance learning. So we can circle back on that if you have questions, but I'm going to pause here and ask Edgar to jump in on any other comments or waivers that might be subject to this.
Yeah, so two things I will note here is, and this gets to a couple of the questions first. So Derek's spot on here about that they don't use a lot of shalls or musts. This is the one few must, and that you must provide distance learning until you're off of the monitoring list for 14 days. Here's the interesting part. If let's use an example, and just because it's here in the area, I'm going to use El Dorado County, who I believe as of today, and my apologies if I'm incorrect, if something has shifted, but I don't believe that they're on the monitoring list. What the language states is if a county is not on the monitoring list and then ends up in the monitoring list because the health situation changes some weeks from now, they are not required to close. They do encourage that you take a look at testing, that you ramp up surveillance of the situation. But that was an interesting note that in that case, if you're not on the list and you've reopened schools, and then you end up on the monitoring list, you don't have to close. So I wanted to point that out. Number two, as Derek stated, there is a provision that states that you can ask for a waiver, that the superintendent of the LEA has the ability to ask for a waiver from their public health officer in consultation. And I know that this is always the tricky part, in working with their stakeholders, consultations with your employee groups, that there is a provision to basically ask a waiver that you can start in-person instruction, even if you're on the monitoring list, if you're in one of those counties. This would, we've gotten the question a number of times about small groups for kids with students with disabilities, small groups with targeted students. So this would definitely apply for that. I think one of the pieces we will be pushing for here in the next couple of days to make that very clear, that was part of a lot of the reopening plans, right? And this was really trying to get to the spirit of what the governor and the legislature wanted, is to get in-person instruction, especially for the most vulnerable students. So there is that provision through the waiver. We are going to push on this just to make sure that in these cases, obviously, I think what they're trying to get at, there's going to have to be some level of buy-in from our employee groups, but the ability to have a path to provide services to those students is something that we will seek to get clarified.
Thank you, Edgar. And just to reiterate, that waiver is for the elementary schools only. So going to the next slide now, and I know that you're gonna have 100 questions on this reopening one, but we're kind of giving you the information that we have at this time as best we understand it. So there's gonna be some follow-up and discussion on that between all of us to better understand it and push them on it. We wanna talk about school sites specifically and when they need to close. So assume that a school site is open, the school is running, providing in-person or hybrid instruction. When does that school site need to close? The short answer is the government is not going to tell us when it needs to close. It's going to tell us when it is recommended and may be appropriate. And it's a multi-factor test that you can look at, and any one or more of the factors can be enough for the school site, for the LEA to decide for that school site to close. The first is that there would be multiple cases in multiple cohorts. Cohorts are students gathered together like in a class or a recess group or a lunch group. Any of those cohorts, if you have one or more students that are having the symptoms and testing positive across multiple cohorts, then we have an obligation to consider whether to close. Number two is based on percentage. This is 5% of the total number of teachers, students, or staff. So all the people on your school site, I'm going to read it exactly as they wrote it, are cases within a 14-day period. I don't know if this is a grammatical typo, so we put it exactly as it's written. But Edgar, did you want to comment on what this percentage-based analysis means?
Yeah, and I think this is where Wes was alluding to, where one of the things, it's interesting, over the last couple of weeks, there was a conversation of making sure that our decisions are grounded in science. And I think we all agree that they should be. You know, we were making light of, there were some comments from the federal government that are actually saying that maybe they shouldn't be grounded in science when the conversation about reopening schools is happening. Now, to Wes's point, some of these pieces get a little confusing from the school leader's perspective in terms of how is this determination going to be made. The 5%, so let's start with schools, as Derek was talking about. With schools, they're trying to get at 5% of the total number of students, teachers, staff, you know, within a 14-day period of tests, the positivity rate. The problem there is that the obvious question is, okay, of what? How do we know? How is if we're a superintendent, how am I going to know in my respective community that 5% of the people that were associated with my school are testing positive? And I think this is going to be a question to the local health officers of what's that communication going to look like with the district. The more practical one, I think, for a school district leader, for a school site leader, is the multiple cases and multiple cohorts. So essentially saying, if your school is broken up into cohorts, whether it be A, B, and you're on a hybrid schedule, or you have smaller cohorts within your campus, and you have confirmed cases in multiple cohorts, so 2 is multiple, then probably the consideration there is, yeah, we should probably close that school. How this then relates to the district, the goal and the spirit here is that if you've closed 25% of your schools within a district, if 25% of schools have had to close because you met this criteria, then the whole district should probably close to try to mitigate community spread. But again, we're going to beat this drum of like the percentage piece is not very intuitive. It won't necessarily be the easiest way for a school district leader to determine that. I think the key piece here is, one, working with your local county health officer will be the main theme here on all of these decisions, to see where is your community, whether it be the school community or district community, from the health standpoint.
Right.
Hey, Derek and Edgar, I'm curious too, if in diving in, you found out some of the confusion that I was having. As I look at some of the chat comments, folks in our field are thinking the cohorts are related to student cohorts as they're planning this A-B multi-cohort approach to reopening. I don't read it that way. I think it intends cohorts to be broadly applied to cohorts of student groups, cohorts of teacher groups, cohorts of classified groups. And so the ambiguity of how cohorts are defined and how that can be applied, again, I think makes it challenging for folks. If a group comes to them and says, we don't feel safe coming back to this campus because you can't prove the cohort rates, and we don't know what the cohorts are supposed to be, what the data is supposed to look like, what the tests are, it makes it hard to defend that position. Is there any clarity around cohorts? Because that's coming up a lot.
I think you're right, Wes. I think the intent, the spirit of this is that it's more than just the student cohorts, because frankly, the best data you're going to have is not on students. And I don't see, even with the testing mandate that the governor is, and I shouldn't say mandate, with the testing initiative that the governor is proposing, the individuals that we're going to have more data about, assuming that this actually happens and our employees do get tests, are the adults, not the students. So what's going to drive that 5% is likely going to be adults. And that's why I think from a practical basis, the confirmed cases in the cohorts, I think that will likely be the default where it's more easily accessible. It's not clear how, even from a testing standpoint, public health will work with the individual LEA to make sure that they know where do we stand in terms of our community positivity rate, or even as we're relating, even more difficult, and we're talking about a school site, talking about, as it states in their language, teachers, students, and staff. Well, what's that universe, and how are they getting that universe within a 14-day period? But you hit it on the head.
Great, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we just talked about when school sites should close. Now we're going to talk about when they should reopen, and the language, again, intentionally squishy. School sites may typically reopen after 14 days and the following items have occurred: cleaning and disinfection, a public health investigation, and consultation with the local public health department. This doesn't say you have to reopen after 14 days. It doesn't say you shall not reopen before 14 days. Every implication is that you should wait the 14 days, but this is another example of where the administration has stopped short of saying you shall stay away for 14 days and do distance learning during that time. Contrast this with the school reopening guidance, our very first slide, which says if you're on the watch list, you're in the penalty box for 14 days and doing distance learning. And we're ready for the next slide, which is about when school districts should close. So a school district that is now open, we're talking about district-wide here. They use the term school district. We're interpreting that to mean LEA as we understand it. So that's the verbiage that we use in this PowerPoint. Superintendent should close the school district if more than 1 in 4 of the schools in the district have closed due to COVID-19 within the last 14 days and in consultation with the local public health department. So here they're looking at sort of aggregate numbers about school closures. It's one thing if you're a big, huge school district and you have 20 or 30 school sites or even more. It's kind of a different equation if you have 1, 2, or 3 school sites. So I think the implication is it's going to really be up to the local consultation between the school leaders and the public health department. Now, one thing to note, when you are providing the in-person instruction, there is no state mandate to close the LEA at any time. So that's what to know about school districts and when to close. Now, when to get back in and reopen the schools, LEAs may typically reopen after 14 days in consultation with their local public health department. Now we want to talk a little bit about testing, and there's a lot of text on the screen, and this is actually one of the cases, this in the next couple of slides, where I will refer you as you go home and look more closely at this information to the documents that we referenced up at the top. This is the framework document, because they provide a lot of detail that I think will be useful for districts to the extent that they can actually do these things. Big caveat there. So for example, if a county is placed on the county monitoring list, schools should begin testing staff or increase the frequency of that testing, but they're not required to close. It's recommended that surveillance testing be implemented based on local disease trends. surveillance testing, something that all of us know a lot about, right? Because we got into school to be educators. Now we're doing surveillance testing, but we can work with our local departments to see if that's possible. We should test staff periodically. And here's what Wes and Edgar were mentioning earlier. The recommendation from the administration is to do a frequency of testing where at least half of your staff is getting tested every month. That means that every 2 months, 100% of your staff is receiving the test. Now, where you get the testing, how this is feasible, how it's all done, who pays for it, a lot of questions there that are unanswered. But if we go to the next slide, there, okay, oh, face coverings. Actually, could we skip ahead to the table? And then we'll come back to that one. I think this is going to provide some additional information for you. Check it out on the framework document. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it does talk about what to do if you start seeing symptoms, how the testing should occur, how you should do sort of local contact tracing within cohorts and classrooms and schools, and what kind of communication that you should do with your communities. So to the extent that you find this part helpful in creating an action plan for your districts, I think there might be some utility in that. But at this point, that's the information that we have on reopening schools, on closing school sites, reopening school sites, closing districts, and reopening districts and testing. So before we go back to the face mask, I'll just ask Edgar or anybody else, any other comments on these particular sections?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to touch on one of the pieces that Wes, started the conversation on, because I think, obviously, and we see it through the chat, and we will, like we've done in every step in this process since the pandemic started, to state throws something out, we try to translate it, we go back, and it always becomes an iterative process. I think they're still calling this interim guidance, so I would not be surprised if there's another iteration at some point. I think the one piece we will look for these opportunities for improvement, but I think it is worth noting that the one piece that our folks felt real strongly about is to have some clear criteria, right? And I think the one thing that hasn't changed this, and this is not the easy part of the job, is that most of these are still going to come down to the district official in working in consultation with their local county health officer, with the exception of that language that Derek talked about in terms of if you're on the monitoring list. So I think that is important to continue to keep in perspective, right? Because it's going to get really easy to get overwhelmed by this, and that they've just made our job harder, right? So I think we just need to parse those out. When in some cases the ability is still going to be there. I say this with the understanding that, as Wes was talking about, in these cases, these aren't easy decisions that you get to make unilaterally. You have a board of education, you have stakeholders, you have parents, you have employee groups, and I think that is going to be the piece there. But in terms of the framing, in terms of, I think one of the things we haven't said, but I think it is at least worth pointing out, that in many of these counties, the question was asked. If we're in a county that we can't open bars, we can't open restaurants, we can't open gyms, should we be opening schools? And I think that was the intent. Whether they got that right or not, I think it was, I'll leave to our folks to interpret that, but that was the spirit of where they were headed in terms of the metrics. I think the pieces here in terms of how do we actually utilize some of these variables, some of the criteria, some of the percentages, because there's some flexibility there. One recommendation we would definitely make is start those conversations with your local county health office of how are we going to operationalize this in our specific community, and take it one step further. So with that, we'll come back and we'll address some of this in the questions. But yeah, let's talk about face coverings.
Hey, before Edgar, we transition to Yvonne, who I know is chomping at the bit to get after it and share. This may have been mentioned before, but I certainly want people to know the question about compelling people to do the distance learning as they prepare to reopen from their physical sites, from their classroom, is absolutely permissible, and is happening all over the state. In fact, why wouldn't that be where we do our teaching? If the collective bargaining agreement stipulates that we come to work, we teach from our classroom, and we're asking people to do nothing but that, why wouldn't we compel them to come back? And it is happening all over the state. So that came up several times in the chat. Sorry, Yvonne.
Well, thank you, Wes. So hopefully here on the face covering side, there's a little bit less ambiguity that's provided from the state. But as you'll see on the slide, second grade and younger are strongly encouraged to wear face coverings. Again, not required for second grade and younger, but strongly encouraged. There is a requirement for face coverings for students that are in third grade and above. And there are some limited times throughout the school day where students do not need to adhere to the requirement. So what is laid out in the guidance is during meal and snack times, during nap time, during outdoor recreational activities as well. But aside from that, all students third grade and above are required to wear face coverings. With that said, there are exemptions for students with certain medical conditions, students who have difficulty breathing, as well as students who are unable to remove a face covering without any assistance. So one other thing related to students and face coverings that was put in the guidance is what happens if you have students who show up to campus who refuse to wear face coverings, or maybe forgot their face covering at home. So let me answer the second anecdote first. So for those who inadvertently failed to bring a face covering with them to school, there is a responsibility on the school's end to develop a policy to provide face coverings for students in these circumstances. And the second anecdote that I provided, when you have students who show up to campus without a mask and refuse to wear one, these students must be excluded from in-person on-campus instruction. Alternative educational distance learning opportunities must be developed and provided to these students. But again, students who show up and just refuse to wear masks, the language in the guidance is that they must be excluded from on-campus activities. And as it relates to staff, there is a requirement for all staff to wear mask coverings as well. And there is some specific exemptions also for staff for certain medical conditions. But staff who fall within these certain medical conditions are still strongly encouraged to wear a non-restrictive alternative, such as a face shield. And in terms of just PPE and how LEAs will pay for these things, it was talked about during the governor's press conference. He referenced a few times one-time monies, particularly federal funds that are going out to LEAs. So that's one thing that the governor is pointing to. But secondly, we have been trying to get access to the statewide stockpile of PPE for quite some time. And the most recent news we got from the Office of Emergency Services is that they anticipate by September 1st that LEAs will have the statewide procurement number to be able to access the statewide stockpile. So that's what I have on face coverings.
Yvonne, let me touch on a couple things on face coverings. So one, we've gotten the question a couple times, the rationale for K through second not wearing face coverings. And I think this has been an evolution, as Yvonne talked about. Initially, as folks may or may not remember, the original CDPH language had a footnote that, the original language on face coverings encouraged it for students, mandated or strongly recommended for staff. Then the governor put forth the statewide face covering order. And in that order, there was an exemption actually for students, for this K-12 system. But that got confusing because it was just done in a footnote. There were groups like ACSA went and said, hey, we need this clarified. This is just confusing folks a little bit more. So they actually removed the footnote. So then that was open to interpretation of kind of where did we leave off there? Where were we at in terms of, does that apply? And I think they've gone back and forth on this. I think this has been an evolution from what we had been told, where trying to strike the delicate balance in terms of making sure that we are trying to cover as many, but being practical in terms of knowing that for young students, this is going to be a lot more difficult. And I think that's where they've looked at some of the other models, whether it be in other states, other countries, and really trying to, they went actually a little bit further than what some of the original thinking appeared to be, that it might exempt all kids in elementary, but they're really trying to focus on some of the youngest students. I will admit that I haven't seen this in writing, so at the risk of being incorrect, I do believe that there was supposed to be some other guidance coming out in terms of sports and whatnot as it relates to schools, and I didn't see it in this industry guidance, but when somebody's actively involved in an activity, that there would be some flexibility there, obviously, for those students when they're actively engaged in those activities. And I think that's consistent with some of the other statewide guidance on face coverings. While I'm talking about young students, let me point out before I forget, we've gotten a number of questions about childcare. Childcare, whether it be at a school district or any other setting, that is governed by separate guidance. And in fact, if somebody on my team I'm going to put them on the spot to find the ISTRC guidance and just share it in the link there. It's in the COVID-19 website. That is still in place. So even with this evolution of the education guidance, childcare programs will still be allowed, and childcare programs on a school setting would still be allowed. And nothing in this guidance is intended to prohibit that, because I'm sure that's going to be one of the big considerations that now school districts are going to have to take into account, almost like they had to take into account in the spring, about what can we offer? Does it make sense to offer? One of the things Wes talked about, we're very sensitive to the equity piece about that. And I know it's something that a lot of our members are, that while we're protecting the health and safety of students and staff, that we have to be mindful of what do our parents, what do our communities do with these students. So childcare would still be allowed, and nothing that happened today is intended to disrupt that. We have a lot of questions, and I'm going to try to do my best to monitor that. If somebody on my team, if they've seen anything that they want to jump in and answer live, I will.
Edgar, I had one. We had one of the comments misrepresent our advocacy, and so I think we have to be clear. If folks aren't tracking our advocacy, we'll certainly try to do a better job of making sure you know exactly what we're saying. But we've never advocated for folks with a pre-existing condition to show up anywhere physically. In fact, we've said just the opposite, that we have to account for those. And we said at the onset of this conversation, our number one priority is the safety of our students and the adults who serve them, period, hard stop. As far as folks going to classrooms, we've never said that people with a pre-existing condition should have to go there either, just so we're clear. And ACSA, I would say, I would challenge anybody to find a group that's advocated more closely aligned to the science and information from CDPH. We have been the strongest supporters of the science that's being applauded in some of the comments. The CDPH guidelines have been the guidelines we've used, that we've shared, when others have deferred to, say, CDEs or CDCs. And so we'll get better at making sure that you folks understand what our advocacy points are. We certainly don't want you to be confused about what we're trying to accomplish.
We've gotten a number of questions. Thanks, Wes. We've gotten a number of questions about adults returning to campus. So I'm going to put Derek on the spot in a second and ask him for the legal interpretation, because they don't reference this directly. And I've heard Derek answer a lot of these questions when they don't spell it out directly in terms of how we should deal with that. But one of the things that I did want to point out, one of the things that we had been fighting for at ACSA is this designation, whether formal or not, that our employees, our school employees, are essential workers. And the guidance does refer to school employees as essential workers. And so remember, even though the governor makes it very, very distinct case that while schools may not be physically open, the instruction and the supports around instruction are still there, namely nutrition services. There's a number of things that will still be taking place on those campuses. We just talked about childcare. So Derek could touch on this, but there's nothing in there that, absent a county health order, that's stating that you folks should not be going on the campus. Just like we saw in the spring, I think the intent here is that those services that need to take place to still support kids, even while we might not be providing in-person instruction on those campuses, that the supports around those students would still be allowable.
Right. So, and some of this does get into the gray area, but nothing prohibits bringing, as you say, bringing employees to campus. Now, I don't have to tell you that you're going to have issues with employee organizations saying, if the campus isn't safe for students and everybody else, that we don't want to go on it. And that's going to be a conversation that you'll have to have locally about what's permissible or allowable, or whether you want to allow the teachers to teach from home or what have you. But yeah, what's very clear is the instruction continues, right? Under no circumstances does the instruction stop. How you and your bargaining partners accomplish that is going to be up to you locally. But if there's one thing I took away from the governor's press conference today, is that we're going to keep teaching kids. And even if we'd rather be in person doing it, and now we're doing it through distance learning due to health concerns, we have to keep the education going because we have an obligation to the students.
There was a question related to face mask and particularly when working with some students with special needs. And so wanted to clarify that the guidance does explicitly state that when working with students with special needs, or when working with particularly young children, that educators can remove their cloth face covering, but there must be a face shield that's used in place of, and still in adherence to social distancing. So it does specifically say that a cloth face covering does not have to be used in certain pedagogical cases, as well as when working with students of younger ages.
And we touched on this before, and I think the guidance and the governor both spoke to the face coverings as referenced. It is allowable to get face masks. I mean, I'm sorry, not face masks, face shields is the word I was looking for, which obviously there's a lot of science there on why that may be a better alternative for younger students. So yes, that is allowable there.
Edgar, can I answer a question about what happens if your school district or school sites are open currently or in the future, but then your county goes on the monitoring list? What happens then? And the guidance does speak to that. It does not say that your school or LEA is required to close. In fact, what it says is schools should begin testing staff or increasing the frequency of staff testing, but you are not required to close. Doesn't preclude you from closing, but it doesn't require you the same way under the school reopening, first day of the school year, you are required to be closed until you're off that watch list.
Yeah, and Wes could touch on this too. We were having conversations with the governor's senior staff, and one of their intents on some of that language is that they're trying to avoid what they deemed this yo-yo effect. That, the governor talks about the dimmer, but that dimmer, they don't want that dimmer to break either by going back and forth, right? Or yo-yoing kids back and forth into distance learning and in-person instruction. So the idea there being that there still be some continuity. So if you weren't on the list, and then that it's not literally a week-to-week basis. Again, it's a broken record here, but as Derek said, there's no firm requirement that you would have to, one, reopen. So again, if you get off the list, that you have to open, or and Derek, as Derek stated that example, that you would have to close. And I invite staff if they see any questions that we can touch on. I saw a couple questions about community college campuses or campuses off the school site. The governor did state that they are working on additional guidance for higher ed as relates to the UCs and whatnot. So I'm sure that will apply also on how to deal with these situations where we have folks on other campuses.
You know, it's worth mentioning the funding here because it's been a big part of the conversation up here in Sacramento, and groups like ours and CTA and CSE and others have talked about. You're going to impose these new guidelines that we're supposed to follow, but those things cost money. Consider the face mask, the PPE, the testing, all of that, the distance learning, getting up to speed on all of that. I just want folks to know, and I think we would all agree with this, that on the ACSA team, we're continuing to push for that funding. And it's not satisfactory for us when we sit in the audience watching the press conference and the governor talks about, well, the way that schools are going to pay for all of these new recommendations, which are not mandates, which would require refunding you, the way that we're going to pay for these recommendations is through what was already provided for you in the Budget Act this year. Well, we know this was a quote unquote hold harmless budget. So I just want to reflect, if you were having those feelings about where's our PPE, where's the technology, where's the connectivity devices, how are we going to pay for all this? Those are things that we are continuing to talk about, and we know this isn't the end all be all, these documents.
Another face covering message, I'll defer to Yvonne, but people again are asking about exemptions, and so there was exemptions. You want to speak to that, whether regardless of grade level, if folks are exempted from wearing the mask if they have special consideration.
Yeah, so related to students, it does specifically say that if students have difficulty breathing or specific medical conditions, that they do not need to wear face coverings. The third grouping of students that is called out is if students are unable to remove a face covering without any assistance, then there's no requirement that those students have to wear face coverings as well.
Let's see, here we touched on child care guidance. Touched on, testing. This is one. So yes, I think we're gonna hear more on testing. So the governor did state, and we were told by senior staff, that the idea here is that those state testing centers, which you could find COVID-19, that those would be, school employees would be eligible to access testing there through those sites. So this is one place where we will be pushing them to work with the county superintendents, with our individual districts, to make sure that that information is very clear. Again, that's not a mandate, and this is again, we're broken record, that the reference here as available with capacity and as practicable. Again, and we already saw it, and I know a number of members, that reference there right away in terms of working with our employee groups could be used in terms of where are we at in terms of the metrics. But the only requirement, this is a recommendation, a consideration for testing that would be eligible for school employees through the state testing locations. That would apply to them. And then the governor earlier this week also made an announcement as it relates to health plans here in California, that they have to make eligible COVID-19 testing free of charge. Derek, one question that somebody alluded to, and I know it's one of the other issues that ACSA is working on, how does this relate, everything we're talking about here in terms of liability and some of our efforts that we're trying to push for in terms of trying to give some protections to our members and to our LEAs around liability and these issues? You want to touch on that?
Sure. We're working with a number of stakeholders on AB 1384, which would provide statutory immunity on any liability related to COVID-19 transmission, subsequent illnesses, deaths, things like that, for school agencies, just because we know that once you open your doors, you're not immune from the rest of the world. Transmission may happen even if you act perfectly. So we're working on that piece of legislation. The way that these new guidances interact with that, right now the bill says you would have to comply with all state, local, and federal laws related to health requirements and develop a local plan around that, you and your governing board, in order to get the statutory immunity. This does not create substantially new requirements, as we've talked about. 98% of the stuff here are recommendations or guidances or suggestions, essentially. But the way that the bill is moving, we think that there is going to be an ask for a number of groups to have more than just requirements, local policies around existing requirements, but to also incorporate some of these guidances to the extent that you can. So we're very cognizant of the fact that we don't want to turn these guidance documents into compliance documents where you have to do it in order to get the immunity, but we are having conversations about the extent to which we can encourage districts to look at them and apply them where it's practical. So that's a good question, and the answer is a little bit complicated. I'll just pause there.
Hey, Derek, let me throw a couple at you, and it's hard to track all of the ones that have been answered and then the ones that are in the chat. So, so forgive me. But one of our members asked about changes to the social distancing. It seemed like when I read it, it was still pretty permissive. It didn't seem to re-articulate or make 6 feet the mandate. It seemed to have that as practicable language in it again, and that's one thing. Folks are asking about the county watch list. In theory, if they're on it all year, they would, at least if they're following county public health guidelines, they would never reopen. And I would just say to that, I won't even force you to answer this one. I think you should plan several contingencies, and for each contingency, ensure that it's high quality learning outcomes. So a year long and a hybrid and a pivot, I mean, that's what folks are gonna have to do. But a question that's come up several times is, if we're on the county watch list, or we're not on, and we start, and then we're on, do we have to close immediately? Can you kind of, or if we're not on, we're not on, do we have to open immediately? Kind of explain the timeline to folks. I've seen several questions about that timeline. Again, the short answer is none of these are forcible up by law. They're not executive orders. There are a lot of guidelines, but anyway, Derek, what do you think about that timeline?
I like it. It's like a lightning round here. So on the, you're open, your county goes on the watch list. What do you have to do? This is a question that came up earlier. The answer, according to the guidance, is sorry, I won't try and find it in my document here. The answer is that you have to increase testing or continue the testing that you're doing, and that's the recommendation, and to work with the local public health officer. You are not required to close, and that's explicit in the guidance. You are not required to close if you go from being open to on the monitoring list. But remember, for the start of the school year, you are required to be closed and use distance learning if you're on a county monitoring list until you've been off it for 14 days. On the 6 feet distancing, oh, go ahead.
No, yeah, I think Wes got it right. Nothing got modified. I know there's been a lot of confusion with the 6 feet because there's several pieces of guidance out there. The California Department of Ed put out guidance, and they talked about it not as a mandate, but a more firm 6 feet. CDPH has talked about it as practicable. We know that there in some counties that has even been modified, and they've given the flexibility to space kids out, but not be firm on the 6 feet. So I think that nothing fundamentally changed on that piece here today, other than this broken record about talking to your local county health office and making sure that those plans are consistent with local guidelines. Let me give a quick pitch for Monday, because I know we're getting a lot of questions on special ed. And Wes, actually, I'll let you do it, because I think this in the next couple of days, we're probably going to get a little bit more information. A lot of questions about bringing in kids to give specific services to students with disabilities. So why don't you talk about the chat you're going to have on Monday, which will probably be focused around.
Yeah, thanks. So Monday night, 5:30 on Facebook, we do a Facebook Live on the ACSA page. This coming Monday, we're going to focus on students with special needs, equity, and UDL. So how do we meet the needs of students in a virtual or hybrid environment? Again, students with special needs, how do we recognize equity? And what does universal design of learning look like, and how does it address all of that? We've got 3 experts, statewide experts, some local experts. It's going to be a great conversation. So if you have questions about special education, tune in Monday night.
we're approaching the hour, and we were trying to be sensitive here to people's time late on a Friday afternoon. We appreciated that we got so much participation. Well, as we've done with some of these other webinars, we will go back and try to answer some of these in that we saw in the chat, put out some follow-up information to all the attendees. Anything that we couldn't answer live, we'll try to go back and clarify. And as what always happens, we said this at the beginning, we were trying to give you as much information as we have. Undoubtedly, some of this will evolve over the next couple of days, or we will get better clarity on this. And just trust that we will continue to put information out to our members in the coming days. Any final themes, questions that we didn't touch on? And if not, then we'll hand it back to Wes to close.
Hey, I just want to thank the team again for diving in and helping out. To all of you, that's where the biggest thanks goes. You're the folks in the front line, serving our students, protecting those adults who serve our students. These are unprecedented times, to say the least. You inspire all of us on the ACSA staff to work harder each day to support you. You encourage us by your efforts. So keep up your great work. Today, we know we didn't answer all the questions. We certainly tried to answer as many as we could with the best information we can get in a short turnaround. I think for no other reason then we know you're worried about these things, and you deserve to go home tonight. You're already home, most of you, but spend the weekend maybe not worrying as much, or with some measure of clarity. We're here to support you. We'll try to get better as we do that. This will be recorded. We'll share it with folks. As Edgar said, we'll get information to you if we couldn't answer the questions. So we'll scour this, try to get more information out. Again, we applaud the governor for trying to depoliticize these issues. We are grateful that he listened to you. We're grateful that you are as loud as you are about safety and equitable education, high quality opportunities for all students. And we're going to keep amplifying your voice to benefit our students, and again, the adults who serve them. So thanks everybody. Be safe, be well. Thanks to the team again.